So it is the first week of September, the year 1812, and you are standing in this lavish, just hastily erected canvas tent right outside the village of Borodino. That's a few dozen miles west of Moscow.
Right in the thick of it.
Exactly. And inside this tent sits Napoleon Bonaparte. He is, I mean, by all contemporary accounts, the most feared, most brilliant military genius on the face of the earth at that time.
Oh, absolutely. The undisputed master of Europe.
Yeah. And he's hunched over a map, right, just furiously dictating orders to his marshals. He commands the artillery to shift to the left flank. He orders the cavalry to sweep through the specific cluster of trees to break the Russian line.
Which is such a cinematic image.
It really is. To anyone watching, this one guy is playing a literal game of chess with the fate of Europe, just moving tens of thousands of lives with a flick of his wrist and a spoken command.
And that right there is the classic, deeply comforting view of how history operates.
Yeah.
We desperately want to believe that someone, somewhere, has their hands firmly on the steering wheel of the world.
Right, but if you step outside that tent, into the smoke and the just deafening roar of cannon fire, a completely different reality is playing out.
A very messy reality.
Utter chaos.
Yeah.
That order to shift the artillery, it never actually arrives because the courier gets killed by shrapnel before he even clears the command post.
Wow. Yeah.
And that brilliant cavalry sweep, the commanding officer on the ground just flat out ignores it because the trees are way too thick and his horses are completely exhausted. So the battle just wages on. It's this chaotic, bloody meat grinder involving hundreds of thousands of men. And it is utterly disconnected from the pristine strategic will of the emperor sitting safely in his tent.
And yet, when the history books are written a decade later...
Right. They'll say Napoleon won the Battle of Borodino through a masterful flanking maneuver.
The disparity there between the lived reality of an event and the tidy, polished narrative constructed by historians later on, it's just staggering. And when you start pulling at that thread, the entire tapestry of how we understand human events really just begins to unravel.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. For you listening right now, consider this a friendly but very serious warning. Today's mission is to completely shatter how you perceive the flow of human events.
We are going after some sacred cows today.
Big time. If you've ever looked at a politician or a CEO or a general and thought, that person is changing the world, prepare to have that illusion dismantled. We are exploring one of the most dense, fascinating, and just radically disruptive pieces of literature ever written.
It really is a masterpiece.
It is the second epilogue to Leo Tolstoy's 1869 novel, War and Peace.
Right. And most people know War and Peace as this colossal, intimidating novel about Russian aristocrats falling in love and going to war.
The ultimate doorstopper book.
Exactly. But by the time Tolstoy reaches the very end of this massive undertaking, he just drops the fictional narrative entirely. He steps into the role of, a rogue philosopher.
Yeah, he just pivots completely.
He does. Having spent years researching the Napoleonic Wars, interviewing veterans, and reading, every historical account he could get his hands on, he realized something profound.
Which was?
That the historians of his day were completely full of it. They were using totally flawed logic to explain massive, terrifying human tragedies.
So our objective for you today is massive. We're going to decode the hidden, microscopic forces that actually move humanity. We're going to explore why the leaders you see on the news are likely just a trick, like a literal optical illusion of power.
The mirage.
Exactly. And finally, we're going to drive right into a philosophical brick wall and confront the ultimate paradox of your existence. Namely, do you actually have free will? Or is every single choice you make, from what you ate for breakfast to who you married, just a mathematical inevitability?
It gets deep. But to get to that ultimate question of free will, we have to start where Tolstoy starts, which is his absolute systematic demolition of traditional history.
He takes no prisoners.
None. He looks out at the intellectual landscape of the 19th century, surveys the people trying to explain the French Revolution and the subsequent wars, and he groups them into three deeply flawed camps.
And he is ruthless about it.
Yeah.
I mean, he's looking at a very specific 20-year period of sheer chaos.
Yeah.
Right, from 1789 to 1812.
Think about the sheer scale of human movement during those 2 decades. It completely defies simple explanation. You have this massive ideological and physical ferment starting in Paris. Millions of people suddenly rise up, the monarchy is toppled, and this chaotic energy begins to spread eastward across Europe.
Like a shockwave?
Exactly like a shockwave, and it collides with a counter-movement from the east, creating incredible friction and warfare. By 1812, this Western force pushes all the way to Moscow, leaving just a trail of burned cities and untended fields.
Just total devastation.
Right. And then, with a terrifying, almost pendulum-like symmetry, it bounces back. It sweeps from east to west, ending right back in Paris where it started.
So we are talking about millions of Christian men who profess a religion of love and turning the other cheek, suddenly abandoning their homes, crossing borders, and just enthusiastically slaughtering each other for 2 decades.
It makes no logical sense.
No. Tolstoy looks at this unfathomable tragedy and asks a really simple question. What force made men act this way? And the answers provided by the historians of his era drive him absolutely crazy.
So the first group he targets is what he calls the biographical historians. We could also call them the proponents of the great man theory of history.
Oh, right. These are the folks who believe history is driven exclusively by the towering genius, or I guess the profound wickedness, of isolated individuals. Your Alexander the Greats, your Julius Caesars, your Napoleons.
Yeah, their entire methodology relies on isolating one person and treating their personal desires as the primary engine of global events. Tolstoy actually writes a devastating parody of their logic in the text.
Oh, I love this part. Break down the parody.
He essentially says that if you read these historians, their whole explanation for the Napoleonic Wars boils down to this. Louis XIV was a very proud man, he ruled his country badly, and he had some mistresses. This caused some people in Paris to write books.
Okay.
Then a genius named Napoleon came along, went to Africa, killed some people, came back to France, and magically everyone just decided to obey him. And because he told them to, they all marched to Russia and started drowning each other.
I mean, when you lay it out like that, it sounds like a ridiculous fairy tale.
Yeah.
It sounds like a child trying to explain how a car engine works by pointing at the steering wheel and saying, the shiny circle makes the car go fast.
That's a perfect analogy.
It completely ignores the combustion, the pistons, the fuel. It's just magically the steering wheel doing all the work.
And the deepest flaw in the great man theory, according to Tolstoy, becomes glaringly obvious the very moment you introduce a second historian into the room.
How so?
Well, if there is only one person writing the history of an era, they can sort of maintain the illusion that a single leader's will caused everything. But the second you have historians from different nations or, different political backgrounds looking at the exact same event, the entire framework just collapses under the weight of their contradictions.
Right. The text highlights a brilliant example of this involving 2 prominent historians of the era writing about Napoleon's rise to power. You have Adolphe Thiers, who was generally sympathetic to Napoleon Bonapartist.
Right.
Thiers writes thousands of pages arguing that Napoleon's power over Europe was generated by his extraordinary virtue, his intellectual brilliance, and his unparalleled strategic genius.
But then Tolstoy points to Pierre Lanfrey, a staunchly Republican historian who just despised the monarchy and the empire. Lanfrey looks at the exact same historical documents, the exact same battles, and concludes that Napoleon's power was completely illegitimate.
So they see the total opposite.
Completely. He argues it was derived solely from his cunning, his deceit, and his ability to basically manipulate the ignorant masses.
So, which is it? Is the magical force that moves millions of people derived from shining virtue or from shadowy trickery?
Exactly. By mutually destroying each other's foundational arguments, Thiers and Lanfrey inadvertently prove that neither of them actually understands the mechanism of history. They are both relying on a totally undefined, unscientific concept of power.
They treat power like a magical aura.
Right, like an aura that some people are just born with, rather than a measurable, observable phenomenon. It's akin to pre-modern scientists saying, fire burns because it contains a magical fire element, rather than actually understanding oxygen and combustion.
So Tolstoy utterly rejects the first camp. The great man theory is dead in his eyes. Which brings us to the second camp, which he calls the universal historians.
Now, these historians consider themselves much more sophisticated.
They definitely do. They look at the great man theory and say, okay, yes, blaming everything on Napoleon's inherent magic is simplistic. Let's look at the broader context.
Their premise is that a historical figure is not a god making choices in a vacuum. Rather, the leader is the product of his time. The leader's power is actually the resultant of a multiplicity of variously directed forces.
Which honestly sounds incredibly modern and reasonable. Like if I were taking a college history exam today and wrote, Napoleon was the inevitable resultant force of the socioeconomic turmoil of post-revolutionary France combined with the geopolitical instability of Europe, I'd probably get an A.
You absolutely would. It sounds highly analytical until you scrutinize how these universal historians actually apply the theory in practice. Tolstoy catches them in a massive, glaring logical contradiction.
What's the trap they fall into?
He points out that if a leader is truly just the product of external forces, like the ideas of 1789, the momentum of the revolution, the economic conditions, then every single action that leader takes must, by definition, be the expression of those forces.
Right. I mean, in physics, if you have three forces pushing an object, the resultant trajectory is the perfect mathematical sum of those three forces. The object doesn't suddenly decide to just veer off course on its own.
But that is exactly what the universal historians claim happens in history. Historians like Gervinus or Schlosser will write volumes explaining how Napoleon was the physical embodiment of the ideas of the revolution.
No.
But then, when Napoleon makes a decision they consider a mistake, like, say, invading Russia in 1812, they suddenly abandon their entire framework. They flip the script and declare, the campaign of 1812 was the product of Napoleon's misdirected individual will.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they accuse him of arresting the development of the very ideas he was supposedly the product of.
You can't have it both ways. You can't say the man is a leaf being blown by the wind of history, and then suddenly claim the leaf turned around and blew the wind backwards just because you don't like where the leaf landed.
It's totally inconsistent. To return to the physics analogy, to find component forces equal to a resultant force, the sum of the components must equal the resultant. The universal historians never observe this vital condition.
They cheat the math.
They absolutely do. By constantly reverting back to the idea of a leader's misdirected will, whenever events don't fit their narrative, they reveal that they haven't actually identified all the forces at play. They are leaving out a massive, unexplained variable that governs the entire equation.
So they realize the biographical historians are wrong, but they don't have a real alternative, so they just dress up the great man theory in more complicated sociological jargon.
Spot on.
Okay, let's look at the third and final camp. Tolstoy calls these the historians of culture. These are the intellectuals who look at the mess of human history and decide that physical leaders aren't the real engine. Instead, they claim that intellectual movements, philosophy, and ideas are the true driving forces of human events.
Right. They attempt to trace the cause of massive physical events back to mental activity.
Hold on, I'm not entirely buying Tolstoy's complete dismissal of this. Look at the French Revolution. You cannot tell me that Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing about equality or the concept of the social contract, had nothing to do with the storming of the Bastille.
You think it's a direct line?
I mean, people literally carried philosophical pamphlets into the streets. They quoted these philosophers while they were tearing down the monarchy. How is that not a direct line of causation? Books spread ideas, ideas change minds, and changed minds take action. That seems perfectly logical to me.
Your reaction is the exact assumption Tolstoy is ruthlessly dissecting here. Let's look closely at that chain of logic. He acknowledges that there is an immense, undeniable number of indications accompanying every historical phenomenon. Yes, books were written. Yes, people read them. Yes, a revolution occurred.
So the correlation is there.
But historians of culture observe this correlation and arbitrarily declare the intellectual activity to be the ultimate cause. Tolstoy argues there is a massive missing link in this causal chain.
What's the missing link? What is he saying they skip over?
The physical mechanism of translation. You can easily understand the mechanics of how a man gives an order to a firing squad, and the soldiers pull the triggers. The chain of physical cause and effect is somewhat visible, even if the concept of power behind it is flawed.
Right.
But Tolstoy asks us to honestly consider the following. How does a book, sitting on a shelf, containing abstract arguments about the equality of man, possess the physical force to make tens of thousands of Frenchmen begin to actively drown, guillotine, and disembowel each other?
So he's saying correlation doesn't equal causation, and we are just ignoring the vast majority of variables that actually turn a thought into a bloody action.
Exactly. The causal nexus between a new philosophical force and a massive, violent physical event is completely unexplained by these historians. Just because a book preceded a war does not mean the book caused the war.
That makes sense.
Tolstoy points out that this intellectual theory of history isn't even confirmed by the facts. Think about it. If doctrines of equality caused the French Revolution, how do you explain the incredibly cruel, unequal, and despotic murders that characterized the Reign of Terror?
Oh, that's a good point.
Or, to take a broader view, how do you explain centuries of brutal, bloody warfare resulting from the preaching of the Christian doctrine of love? If ideas cause actions, the actions should reflect the ideas. They rarely do.
That is a staggering point. If the idea was the engine, the vehicle wouldn't be driving in the exact opposite direction. Tolstoy has a rather biting, almost cynical critique of why historians fall into this specific trap, doesn't he?
Oh, he attributes it to profound professional vanity.
Natural.
History is, by definition, written by learned men, scholars, academics, writers. It is incredibly flattering and naturally agreeable for a writer to conclude that the activity of their own specific class intellectual activity is the fundamental basis for the movement of all humanity.
Everyone thinks their own profession is the center of the universe. The merchants think global trade moves the world. The generals think military strategy moves the world. And the guys writing the books conveniently conclude that writing books moves the world.
Exactly. And Tolstoy synthesizes his disdain for these three camps with a really brilliant analogy about economics. He compares historians of culture and universal history to people dealing in fake currency.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand this analogy completely. Break down the paper money and the base metal.
Sure. Imagine an economy operating on paper money. That paper money represents the old great man theories of the biographical historians. It's accepted by the masses, it's easy to trade, but it's intrinsically worthless. Eventually, people start to realize the paper money is flawed.
So they demand something real.
Right. So the universal historians and cultural historians step in and say, we have a solution. We will replace the paper money with metal coins.
But they don't actually use gold, do they?
No, they mint coins out of base metals like brass or tin. When you drop these new historical theories on the table, they make a very satisfying metallic jingling sound.
They sound impressive.
They look shiny. They easily deceive the ignorant who just want something heavier than paper. But if you try to weigh them, if you test their specific gravity, you realize they are fundamentally hollow. They aren't gold.
And what represents the gold in this analogy?
Real gold is valuable because it possesses intrinsic, undeniable properties. In history, the gold would be a theory that actually answers the essential, fundamental question. What is the genuine, measurable force that compels millions of men to move and act in unison?
And these theories don't do that.
No, these historians evade the question entirely, substituting complex sociological jargon or cultural analysis for actual mechanics. They serve as perfectly acceptable currency in university seminars for people who enjoy serious reading, but they completely fail to explain reality.
Wow. We've just spent a significant amount of time tearing down literally everything we thought we knew about history. If we can't blame great men wielding magical inherent power, and we can't blame big ideas floating in the intellectual ether, we are left staring into a massive void.
It's quite the philosophical cliff to hang off of.
It really is. If none of that is real, then what exactly is power? How does any massive event actually happen?
This brings us to the pivotal hinge of the entire text. Tolstoy completely redefines the concept of power. He strips away centuries of mythology and romance. He argues that power is not a tangible substance. It is not an aura. It is not a divine right. Power is simply a highly specific mathematical relationship between people.
A relationship? That sounds incredibly abstract. How does he visualize this? Because grasping how a king is actually powerless requires a total rewiring of how we see the world.
He offers several vivid analogies to break this down. Let's return to the campaign of 1812. Traditional history dictates that Napoleon wished to invade Russia. He expressed that wish through orders, and the massive French army moved. His singular will caused the event. It's a clean line from brain to action.
But if you actually dive into the historical archives, you realize that clean line is a total fabrication, right?
Absolutely. You never find a single, pristine expression of a wish that magically translates into a continent-spanning invasion. What you actually find are thousands and thousands of orders, letters, and decrees pointing in every conceivable direction.
It's just a shotgun blast of commands.
Yes. Napoleon was constantly issuing commands that were utterly ignored, physically impossible to execute, or just immediately contradicted by the reality on the ground.
This makes me think of the stencil analogy. It's one of the most striking visuals in the entire piece.
Walk us through it.
Imagine a large piece of cardboard with a complex, beautiful floral pattern cut out of it, like a stencil. Now imagine placing that stencil against the blank wall. Someone takes a bucket of paint and a massive brush, and they just start violently, indiscriminately smearing paint all over the cardboard.
Just total chaos, paint going everywhere.
Right. But when you pull the cardboard away, you are left with a perfectly defined, beautiful painted flower on the wall. Now, a traditional historian looks at that flower and says, "Behold." The painter brilliantly and deliberately applied the color only to those specific areas to create this masterpiece.
But the painter didn't do that at all.
Exactly. The shape of the flower was dictated entirely by the holes that were already cut into the cardboard. The paint just filled in the negative space.
That's it. And Tolstoy says Napoleon's orders are the indiscriminate smears of paint, the inevitable course of historical events driven by the collective momentum of millions of people is the stencil. Amidst the massive sea of unexecuted chaotic orders Napoleon issued, one specific series of commands happened to perfectly coincide with the path the army was already inevitably taking.
So the commands didn't create the shape of the event, they just happened to fill in the gaps.
We look back and think Napoleon's orders caused the invasion, but that's only because we selectively highlight the few orders that aligned with the outcome, and we completely ignore the thousands of commands that didn't fit the stencil and were instantly forgotten by history.
That is profound.
Mm-hmm.
But he has an even more visceral way of explaining the illusion of leadership, the ship and the bow wave.
This one is my favorite.
It's so good. Imagine you were standing on the deck of a massive, heavy steel dreadnought. You walk all the way to the very front, the bow, and you lean over the railing, looking straight down into the water.
And as the immense mass of the ship moves forward through the ocean, it displaces the water ahead of it, creating this violent, churning, foaming wave right at the tip of the bow.
Now, if you are standing there, hyper-focused only on the water immediately in front of you, what do you see? You see this aggressive, fast-moving wave. From that limited vantage point, it completely looks like the wave is leading the ship. It appears to be cutting the path, directing the vessel, anticipating every turn.
But the moment you step back, walk to the shore, and look at the entire vessel from a distance, the optical illusion completely vanishes. You realize the wave isn't pulling or directing the ship at all.
Right, the wave has no engine. It has no rudder.
Exactly. The immense, unseen mass of the ship, driven by the deep engines far below the waterline, is simply pushing the water forward. The wave is nothing more than a noisy, highly visible byproduct of the ship's momentum. And Tolstoy delivers this crushing blow to the ego of great men everywhere. Leaders, kings, generals, politicians, CEOs, they are just the bow wave.
They're just the foam.
It is the ultimate demotion of historical figures. We view them from our limited perspective, standing on the deck of current events, and they appear to govern the movement of society. They make the loudest noise, they are the most visible, but they are merely foaming ahead of a ship driven by forces they do not control.
This radically changes the definition of what a leader actually does then. If they aren't the engine, what is their function in this mathematical relationship of power?
Well, Tolstoy defines power as an inverse relationship between making a decision and physically carrying it out. Think about the architecture of any massive collective action, like a war.
Okay.
At the very bottom of the hierarchy, you have the frontline foot soldier. What is their role? They do almost all of the physical labor. They dig the trenches, they march through the mud, they fire the weapons, they take the bullets.
Right.
But crucially, they have absolutely zero say in the moral justification for the war. They don't declare why they are fighting, they just fight.
And as you move up the chain of command, the physical labor decreases, but the moral justification increases. The captain digs fewer trenches, but gives more orders.
Yeah.
The general stays far behind the lines, engaging in zero physical combat, but writes the strategic plans.
And at the absolute pinnacle of this pyramid is the commander-in-chief, the king or the emperor. This person never physically fires a rifle. They never face a bayonet. Their entire participation in the event consists of expressing opinions, making predictions, and, most importantly, providing the moral justification for the collective action of the masses.
Right, they give the speeches saying, we march to spread civilization, or we fight to defend the homeland.
Therefore, Tolstoy concludes his definition of power. The more a person expresses opinions and justifications for a collective action, the less physical participation they have in the actual event. The masses provide the physical momentum, the engine of the ship. The leaders provide the words, the foam of the bow wave.
Think about the massive implications of this for a moment. Just apply this lens to the modern world. Look at corporate structures. A CEO stands on a brightly lit stage in a turtleneck, presenting a grand, 5-year strategic vision to shareholders.
Classic.
They talk about revolutionizing the industry, acting as if their pure, singular genius is directing the fate of a multinational corporation. But beneath them are tens of thousands of engineers, factory workers, supply chain managers, and millions of consumers whose collective momentum, shifting desires, and daily labor are actually moving the market.
The CEO isn't dragging the company into the future. They are riding the momentum of a massively complex socioeconomic machine and retroactively claiming their vision caused the movement. They are the bow wave.
It completely changes how you consume news. Every time a politician claims, I created 10,000 jobs or I single-handedly shifted the culture, Tolstoy is essentially sitting in the corner laughing, pointing out that they are just a tiny wave foaming ahead of a massive dreadnought.
It's very humbling.
But this realization creates a terrifying vacuum for anyone trying to understand the world. If events aren't discrete, isolated things caused by a leader giving an order, how do we actually study history? If we throw out the great men and we throw out the big ideas, what is left to analyze?
Tolstoy anticipates this exact despair and offers a highly specific, fundamentally mathematical solution. He argues that historians have failed because they are using the wrong tools to measure reality. He introduces a concept he calls the integration of infinitesimals.
Okay, the calculus of human history. For anyone whose brain just shut down the word calculus, we definitely need to break this down clearly.
It's actually a beautiful way to look at the world once you grasp the mechanism. What's fascinating here is that the fundamental flaw of human perception is that we struggle to comprehend continuous, unbroken motion.
We really do.
We like things to have clear beginnings and clear endings, but reality doesn't work that way. The movement of humanity is a continuous flow arising from an innumerable amount of arbitrary human wills. The flow never stops. There is no such thing as the beginning of an event.
Right, the universe doesn't just pause.
Exactly. So how does a historian attempt to study this continuous flow? They perform an artificial surgical procedure. They arbitrarily chop the timeline into discrete segments. They take a specific grouping of years, isolate it from the millions of years before and after, and draw a box around it, labeling it the French Revolution or the War of 1812.
Right, they package it neatly.
And then, having isolated this fake chunk of time, they look for a single man to represent the sum total of all the complex forces operating within that box.
Which is like trying to understand the flow of a massive river by scooping out a single bucket of water, staring at it, and ignoring the mountains where the snow melted and the ocean where the river is heading.
To explain why isolating events and blaming prominent figures is a trap, Tolstoy deploys some brilliant analogies concerning how we confuse coincidence with cause. Let's look at the clock tower analogy.
This one perfectly illustrates the trap of human perception.
Imagine you are looking at your pocket watch. The minute hand slowly ticks upward, and the moment it aligns perfectly with the number 12, the massive iron bells of the church tower across the street begin to violently ring, tolling noon.
Okay, I see where this is going.
The two events happen simultaneously. A naive observer might look at that sequence and conclude, the physical movement of the tiny hands on my watch caused those massive bells to ring.
Because they always happen together. Every time the hands reach 12, the bells ring. It looks exactly like cause and effect.
But we know that's absurd. The hands on the watch possess no physical mechanism to move tons of iron across the street. It is a mere coincidence of timing, driven by a deeper, unseen law of timekeeping that governs both the watch and the bell tower independently.
He takes us a step further with the locomotive analogy.
Yes. Imagine standing by a railroad track as a massive steam locomotive thunders past. You see the massive steel drive wheels turning, you see the valves opening and closing, and you hear the deafening shriek of the steam whistle. A child, overwhelmed by the sensory input, might point to the whistle and say, the loud noise is making the heavy train move.
Because the whistle is the most prominent, noticeable feature.
It makes the most noise, just like a politician giving a speech.
Exactly.
But an engineer knows the whistle doesn't cause the movement. The whistle is merely an accompanying phenomenon, a byproduct of the pressurized steam that is actually driving the pistons. The child has mistaken the loudest coincidence for the deepest cause.
Tolstoy even points to agricultural folklore to show how deeply embedded this cognitive flaw is in human nature. He mentions the peasant logic regarding oak trees and the wind.
Right. In rural Russia, the peasants observed that every single spring, right when the tiny buds on the oak trees began to unfold, a cold wind would sweep across the plains. Because these two things consistently happened at the same time, the peasants concluded that the unfolding of the oak buds caused the cold wind to blow.
The human brain is just an incredibly powerful pattern recognition machine. We are evolutionarily wired to link things together. Oak bud opens, wind blows, Leader speaks, war starts. But an oak bud doesn't possess the meteorological force to alter global weather patterns.
And history falls into this exact same trap over and over again. Historians see a king issue a decree, and a month later, a war begins. They leap up and say, aha, the decree caused the war. Just like the oak bud caused the wind. They are constantly taking a weaker, highly visible phenomenon and mistakenly assigning it as the cause of a massively complex, stronger phenomenon.
So if we realize we've been staring at the clock hands and the train whistle our whole lives, how do we actually figure out what makes the train move?
This is where we return to calculus. Tolstoy argues that to understand the true laws of history, we must completely abandon our obsession with kings, ministers, and generals. We must stop trying to measure the whole by looking at the largest parts. Instead, we have to look at the infinitesimally small.
The differential of history.
Think about how calculus solves the problem of measuring irregular areas. If you have a curve on a graph and you want to know the exact area underneath it, you can't just slap a big square over it and guess. That's what traditional historians do.
Right.
Calculus says, instead of one big square, slice that area into an infinite number of impossibly thin, infinitesimally small rectangles. Calculate the area of those tiny microscopic slivers and then integrate them. Add them all up.
Taking that pure mathematical concept and applying it to human behavior is just staggering.
Tolstoy is saying that the infinitesimally small rectangles of history are the individual tendencies, the daily choices, the minuscule desires of everyday anonymous people, the peasants, the foot soldiers, the merchants.
People actually doing the work.
Exactly. Only by finding a way to study these millions of infinitesimally small units and then attaining the mathematical art of integrating them, summing them up to see the broader curve they create, can we ever hope to arrive at the true laws of human movement.
He is essentially prophesying the era of big data and sociology a century before it even arrived. He's arguing that the truth of human behavior isn't found in the biographies of great men. It's found in the aggregate metadata of millions of ordinary lives. It's an incredibly modern statistical view of reality.
It is brilliant, but it is also deeply dangerous to our sense of self. Because if we follow this mathematical deterministic view of history to its logical conclusion, we drive headfirst into a terrifying philosophical brick wall.
Because if history is just a giant calculus equation, if the movement of humanity is just the inevitable sum of millions of tiny forces reacting to environment and biology, acting exactly like particles in a physics experiment, what happens to me? What happens to my choices?
This marks the moment where the second epilogue transcends a mere critique of historical methodology and becomes a profound existential meditation on the human condition. We arrive at the ultimate conflict, the battle between free will and necessity. Or, to put it another way, the illusion of choice versus the reality of determinism.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there because every fiber of my being wants to reject this. It is intensely uncomfortable to be told that we're just math. Let's do a physical test right now.
All right, let's see it.
I am holding a pen in my hand right now. I am looking at it, and I drop it. Boom, it hits the desk. I chose to do that. Nothing in my environment forced me to drop it. No historical momentum pushed my fingers apart. I generated the will to open my hand, and I executed the action. Doesn't that tiny, insignificant act fundamentally prove that I possess absolute free will?
It feels like the ultimate mic drop, doesn't it? But Tolstoy anticipates this exact instinctive pushback. He literally writes in the text, you say, I am not free, but I have lifted my hand and let it fall. Everyone understands that this illogical reply is an irrefutable demonstration of freedom.
It feels entirely irrefutable. How can he argue against the direct physical sensation of my own agency?
He dismantles it by drawing a sharp, uncompromising line between two fundamentally different ways humans interface with reality: reason versus consciousness. The trap you just fell into with the pen is confusing one for the other.
Walk me through the difference, because my brain is screaming that I made a free choice.
Let's look at reason first. Reason is the tool we use to observe the world from the outside. It is the foundation of science, of observation, of logic. When we use reason, we look at human beings not as magical spirits, but as subjects of observation, exactly the same way we observe planetary bodies in astronomy or cellular structures in biology.
So through the lens of reason, humans are basically just complex biological machines.
Precisely. And reason, supported by a relentless series of experiments and arguments, proves to us that we are subject to immutable laws. You cannot choose to ignore the law of gravity. If you step off a cliff, you will fall, regardless of your willpower.
Okay, sure.
As science advances, reason increasingly shows that our actions are deeply dependent on our physiology, the firing of our nervous system, our genetic predispositions, and the environmental stimuli surrounding us. Reason demands a universe governed strictly by cause and effect. Under the scrutiny of reason, every action has a prior cause, meaning absolute freedom cannot exist. Necessity rules.
Okay, I can see that my biology is bound by physics. But what about the voice in my head that decided to drop the pen? Where does that fit in?
That is consciousness. Consciousness is entirely different from reason. Consciousness is how we know ourselves from the inside. It is our internal, lived, subjective experience, and consciousness absolutely, unequivocally demands that we feel free.
It's the pilot sitting in the cockpit of the biological machine.
Yes, and Tolstoy makes a stunning claim about this internal pilot. He says that without this irrational, unscientific conception of freedom, you wouldn't just be a bit confused. You literally could not live for a single moment.
Wait, really? Why is the illusion of freedom biologically necessary for survival?
Think about what drives human behavior. Every single effort a human makes, every ambition, every struggle, is fundamentally an attempt to increase their freedom. The pursuit of wealth over poverty, health over disease, knowledge over ignorance, power over submission, these are all just attempts to secure greater degrees of freedom.
That's true.
If you truly internalized determinism, if you believed deep in your marrow that you had absolutely zero free will, that the script of your life was entirely pre-written by the calculus of the universe, the psychological impact would be catastrophic.
I mean, I'd never get out of bed.
Yeah.
Why try to learn? Why try to build? Why try to survive if the outcome is already locked in?
Exactly. Life would cease to be life. It would become paralyzed observation. So we are trapped in a staggering tension. On one hand, science, even the early physiology and comparative zoology of Tolstoy's time, increasingly proves that our muscles twitch because of electrical impulses we don't control, and that we are part of a continuous chain of animal evolution. Reason tells us we are bound by necessity. But on the other hand, to simply wake up, breathe, and function in society, our lived human experience requires the persistent, unshakable illusion of absolute freedom.
We are simultaneously biological robots and beings who must believe we are gods of our own destiny.
And Tolstoy points out the arrogance of people who try to solve this by entirely dismissing one side. He mocks the crowd of ignoramuses who read a little bit of biology, realize nerves control muscles, and smugly declare, see, free will doesn't exist, problem solved.
Because proving that biology has mechanical laws only illuminates the reason side of the equation. It doesn't extinguish the undeniable visceral reality of the consciousness that still feels the choice to drop the pen.
Precisely. The tension remains unresolved. But Tolstoy argues that history, as a discipline, actually has a massive advantage over theology or pure philosophy in dealing with this paradox.
How so?
History doesn't have to definitively solve the metaphysical mystery of whether the soul is free or bound. History's job is simply to look at how free will actually manifests in the past. It surveys human life after the fact, looking at events where the union of these two contradictions, freedom and necessity, has already occurred.
So if history isn't trying to prove absolute free will or absolute determinism, how does it actually judge a human event?
Tolstoy introduces the concept of the relativity of freedom. He argues that trying to label an action as 100% free or 100% determined is a fool's errand. It is never a binary yes or no question. It is always a sliding scale. Every single human action we examine is a complex amalgamation of freedom and inevitability.
And the really fascinating part is that the ratio of freedom to necessity isn't fixed. It shifts.
Yeah.
Depending on how we look at an event, the amount of free will we perceive grows or shrinks in an inverse relationship to the amount of inevitability we perceive.
He outlines 3 specific factors that alter this ratio. Understanding these 3 factors is crucial to grasping his entire philosophy of human judgment.
Let's dive into the first factor. It deals with our relation to the external world, or what we might call physical context. How clearly do we perceive a person's physical and social circumstances at the moment they act?
To illustrate this, Tolstoy uses visceral life-or-death examples. Imagine a man drowning in a freezing river. In his panic, he violently clutches at another person swimming near him, dragging them both underwater to their deaths.
Okay, horrifying.
Or consider a mother, totally exhausted, starving to death in a famine, who steals a loaf of bread to feed her dying baby. Or a highly disciplined soldier standing in a strict military formation who is ordered by his commander to fire his weapon into a crowd.
If we fully understand the immense, crushing weight of those specific circumstances, the water filling the lungs, the agony of starvation, the psychological conditioning of military discipline, how do we judge those actions?
We view them as having very little free will. The environment, the external world, is exerting such massive pressure that the action seems almost entirely subject to the law of necessity. The man didn't choose to drown his rescuer. His biology forced him to panic. Because we see the necessity so clearly, we judge them as less guilty.
But imagine if we strip away that context. What if we don't know the circumstances? What if we just read a sterile police report that says, man pulled another man underwater, or woman stole bread?
Without the context of the external world, the action suddenly appears entirely free. We see an unprompted, malicious choice, we hold them fully responsible and demand harsh punishment. The profound takeaway here is that the more clearly we see a person's connection to their external environment, their poverty, their trauma, their immediate physical danger, the more our conception of their freedom shrinks, replaced by an understanding of their inevitable reality.
That immediately leads into the second factor, which focuses on our relation to time, temporal distance. This explores how our perception of an event changes based on how long ago it happened.
We all experience this in our own lives, driven by the psychology of hindsight bias. Think about a mundane action you performed just an hour ago. Let's say you were walking and arrived at an intersection and you chose to walk down the left street instead of the right.
Sure.
If you think about that choice right now, it appears completely, 100% free. In your memory, the feeling of alternate possibilities is still fresh. You easily could have gone right.
But what happens when we drastically expand the timeline? What if I examine a massive life choice I made 10 years ago, like accepting a specific job offer or moving to a new city?
The sensation of freedom evaporates. Because when you look back 10 years, you don't just see the isolated choice. You see the massive, unbroken chain of consequences that followed. You realize that if you hadn't taken that specific job, you never would have met your current spouse, you wouldn't have had your children, you wouldn't live in your current home.
The weight of everything that happened after the choice makes the choice itself feel like destiny. It becomes impossible to imagine an alternate reality because the current reality is just so dense and solidified in my memory. The subsequent events piled on top of the decision, cementing it into an inevitable past.
Exactly. And Tolstoy scales this psychological phenomenon up to the level of global history. He compares contemporary events to ancient ones. He points to the Austro-Prussian War, which was happening around the time he was writing. To the people living through it, it seemed driven by the immediate, capricious free will of politicians like Otto von Bismarck. You could point to a specific argument or treaty and say, that caused the war.
But then he asks us to look at the Crusades, or the mass migration of peoples across Europe during the fall of the Roman Empire.
When we look at the Crusades, separated by centuries of time, we don't view it as a random event caused by the free will of a few grumpy knights or a single persuasive pope. We see it as a massive, inevitable historical era. It occupies a definite, necessary place in the timeline of human development.
That makes total sense. Time dilutes the illusion of freedom. The farther back in history we look, the more the chaotic, supposedly free choices of individuals blur into the smooth, predictable curves of inevitable historical laws.
It's terrifying how time erases our agency in the eyes of observers.
All right, the third and final factor in the relativity of freedom, relation to causes. This is perhaps the most profound. It argues that the better we understand why someone did something, the less free they appear.
This strikes at the very heart of human judgment. When we encounter an action where we cannot comprehend the cause, whether it is a horrifically violent crime or an act of tremendous selfless heroism, we default to ascribing a massive amount of free will to the actor.
Right, if a seemingly normal person suddenly commits a terrible crime, and we can find no motive, no history of violence, no clear catalyst, we are terrified. We say they are a monster who made a pure, freely chosen evil decision, and we demand maximum punishment.
But the moment we begin to discover the underlying causes, the element of necessity starts to creep in, mitigating the illusion of complete freedom. Tolstoy gives the example of a criminal. If the court learns that the criminal was raised from birth in a community of thieves, that they suffered severe childhood trauma, or that they have a neurological defect, their fault is mitigated in our eyes. We start to see how their past mathematically added up to their present crime.
The same applies to lesser vices. If you see someone relapse into addiction and you know nothing about them, you might judge it as a weak, freely chosen moral failure. But if you know their family history, their genetic predisposition, and the immense psychological triggers they face that day, It looks far less like a free choice, and much more like an inevitable compulsion.
The overarching principle uniting all three of these factors, environment, time, and cause, is really just a question of perspective.
The best way I can visualize this shifting perspective is to think about a massive, incredibly high-resolution photograph. Imagine zooming all the way in on this digital image until your screen is entirely filled by a single person, frozen in a fraction of a second.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
There is no background visible, there is no context of what happened before or after the flash, and you have no idea what they're thinking. Isolated in that extreme close-up, they look completely free. They look like an independent agent operating in a void.
But the moment you start to zoom out,
The illusion breaks. You zoom out to reveal the external world, the environment pressing in on them. You zoom out further to see the timeline, the events leading up to this exact moment. You zoom out to understand the psychology and the causes, and suddenly you realize you aren't looking at a free agent at all. You are looking at a single, locked-in pixel trapped in a much larger, inevitable image.
wow.
The freedom wasn't an actual property of the person. It was merely an optical illusion caused by the observer standing too close to the subject.
That is a phenomenal synthesis of his argument. The closer we look and the less we know, the more freedom we see. The wider we look and the more we understand, the more inevitability we see. And this realization leads us directly to the climax of the second epilogue.
The big shift.
Having laid out the calculus of history and the relativity of freedom, Tolstoy demands that humanity make a radical, terrifying leap in how we study ourselves. He calls for a Copernican shift in history.
He compares the study of human history to the study of astronomy. At first glance, comparing armies to planets seems strange, but the parallel he draws is absolutely perfect.
To understand what Tolstoy is demanding, we have to travel back to the world before Nicholas Copernicus. We have to put ourselves in the mindset of humans living under the Ptolemaic model of the universe. For thousands of years, every human being felt, with every fiber of their sensory apparatus, that the Earth was perfectly, solidly still.
It's basic common sense. I stand on the ground, and it doesn't move. I don't feel any wind from the Earth spinning. I don't feel any vibration.
And when you look up at the sky, your eyes clearly show you the sun rising in the east, traveling across the sky, and setting in the west. The stars wheel around you at night. Everything in your immediate visceral experience screams that you are the stationary center of the universe, and everything else is moving around you.
Human ego and physical sensation align perfectly.
But then Copernicus and later astronomers start doing the math, and they realize that if the Earth is stationary, the movements of the planets make absolutely no mathematical sense. They have to invent absurd, convoluted theories about planets moving in tiny backward loops just to explain the observations. The only way the math works, the only way to discover the true, elegant laws of planetary motion, is to do something incredibly difficult.
You have to literally reject your own senses.
Exactly. Humanity had to renounce its immediate physical sensation of immobility. We had to accept emotion that we could not feel. We had to say, even though my body tells me the Earth is still, my reason dictates that we are hurtling through space at thousands of miles an hour.
Tolstoy explicitly writes, "It is true that we do not feel the movement of the Earth, but by admitting its immobility we arrive at absurdity, while by admitting its motion we arrive at laws."
And here is the genius of his conclusion. He declares that the science of history is standing at this exact same crossroads.
History is waiting for its Copernicus. It is waiting for the moment we stop believing the illusion.
In astronomy, the great obstacle to truth was the physical sensation of the Earth's immobility. In history, the great obstacle to truth is the psychological sensation of the independence of personality. It is our desperate internal feeling of absolute free will.
So if we want to discover the actual functional laws of human movement, if we want to understand why wars happen, why societies rise and fall, why millions of people move in unison, we have to make the same radical renunciation. We have to abandon our immediate visceral sensation that we and our leaders are entirely free agents.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we must recognize a dependence on the external world, a dependence on time, and a dependence on an infinite chain of causation that we cannot physically feel in our daily lives.
It is a total renunciation of the human ego. It means admitting that the king is not a god, the CEO is not a genius, and I am not the sole author of my destiny. And just as in astronomy, the resistance to this new, humbling view of reality is immense.
Tolstoy documents this struggle beautifully. He reminds us of the sheer panic that gripped society when physics and astronomy were making these discoveries. When Newton and Copernicus presented their findings, theology fought back with everything it had. Religion stood as the fierce guard for the old, Earth-centric views.
Because it threatened their entire worldview. The church feared that if you admit the earth moves, you destroy the special central place of humanity in God's creation. You invalidate biblical miracles, like the story of Joshua commanding the sun to stand still in the sky. If the sun doesn't move, the miracle is a lie. Thinkers like Voltaire even weaponized the law of gravitation, trying to use it to disprove religion entirely.
And Tolstoy says that modern institutions, governments, legal systems, traditional historians fight against the idea of historical determinism for the exact same reasons. They look at the law of inevitability and they are terrified. They think, if we admit that people are bound by necessity, we destroy the conception of the human soul. We destroy the very concepts of good and evil. How can we punish a criminal or reward a hero if they weren't entirely free? All our institutions of state and church will collapse.
It feels like an existential threat to society itself.
But Tolstoy counters this fear with a message of profound hope. He argues that the panic is entirely misplaced. Look at what actually happened with astronomy. The laws of planetary motion didn't destroy theology. They didn't end the human belief in the divine. They simply destroyed a false, primitive understanding of it. Eventually, understanding the true vastness and mathematical perfection of the solar system gave theology a new, much firmer, infinitely grander foundation.
Acknowledging the truth didn't destroy the world, it just made our understanding of it more accurate.
In the exact same way, acknowledging the law of historical inevitability does not destroy human morality. It does not mean good and evil cease to exist. It simply forces us to reevaluate our morality, our laws, and our history on a foundation of verifiable truth, rather than clinging to the comforting illusions of magical leaders and absolute freedom.
The scope of what we have covered today is just breathtaking.
Yeah.
It genuinely rewires how you interface with reality. Let's try to encapsulate this massive journey we've been on, because it is a lot to process.
We began by ruthlessly dismantling the traditional ways we understand history. We threw out the biographical great man theory, exposing the absurdity of believing that isolated geniuses with magical inherent power dictate the fate of millions.
Yep.
We rejected the universal historians for their logical contradictions, and we dismissed the cultural historians who naively believed that abstract philosophical books possess the physical force to magically cause people to slaughter each other.
Then we redefined power. We exposed leaders as nothing more than the foaming bow wave of a massive ship. They look important, they make the most noise, and they issue endless moral justifications. But they're actually just being pushed forward by the massive unseen momentum of the millions of people laboring beneath them.
From there, we established that to truly understand the mechanics of history, we must stop looking at the kings and generals. We must embrace the calculus of history, integrating the infinitesimally small elements, the daily lives, the mundane choices, the collective metadata of millions of individual human wills.
And finally, we collided with the ultimate paradox of existence. We realize that while our internal consciousness screams that we have free will to drop a pen or choose a path, our reason clearly demonstrates that we are bound by biological and environmental necessity. And to truly understand human events, we have to make that terrifying Copernican shift. We must accept that our feeling of absolute freedom is an illusion, a trick of perspective, and that we are inextricably shaped by our environment, by the passage of time, and by a chain of causes we can barely comprehend.
It is a completely different, deeply humbling way to view our place in the universe.
It really is. And for you listening, I want to leave you with a highly practical application of this philosophy. The next time you open a news app or turn on the television and you see a politician standing at a brightly lit podium giving a grand, sweeping speech claiming they alone are going to change the course of history, stop.
Just pause.
Look past them. Stop letting your eyes be drawn to the loud, foaming water at the bow of the ship. Instead, look deeper. Try to identify the massive underlying currents of the masses, the economic shifts, the demographic changes, the collective anxieties that are actually providing the engine force pushing that ship forward, regardless of who happens to be standing on the deck.
That is the perfect practical takeaway. But I want to leave the listener with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over, building directly on what we just discussed about the relativity of freedom. We established, through Tolstoy's 3 factors, that our perception of someone's free will shrinks the more we understand their background, their biology, and the causes of their actions.
Right, the more we zoom out, the less free they look.
So what does that imply for the future of our modern justice system? Every court of law currently operates on the foundational premise of individual responsibility and absolute free choice. But we are living in an era of rapid scientific advancement. We are learning more every day about neuroscience, genetics, trauma, and sociology. If we continue on this trajectory, and we ever reach a point where we achieve near perfect knowledge of all the causes, chemical, environmental, historical, that inevitably lead a person to commit a specific act, does the concept of guilt disappear entirely? If we can perfectly map the necessity of an action, can we still punish the actor?
Wow. That X-ray machine of history really does break everything when you point it at the present, doesn't it? If the illusion of free will is required to live, how much of that illusion is required to maintain a society? That is a question to keep you awake at night. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the forces around you, look past the bow wave, and we will see you next time.